Okay, ladies and gentlemen, let's make a start. I'm Philip McCosker, the director of the von Hügel Institute, and it's my very great pleasure and privilege to welcome you most warmly to the annual von Hügel lecture for 2018. It's wonderful to see so many of you here and so many fresh faces. You're all most welcome. As many of you know, but it bears repeating on occasions like this, the von Hügel Institute for Critical Catholic Inquiry, or the VHI as we tend to know it around here, is an interdisciplinary research institute anchored in the idea of Catholicity, which we understand primarily in its etymological sense, from the Greek katholou, meaning according to the whole. So at the heart of our institute is an integral or holistic optic. So our group of over 30 researchers work in a riotous plurality of disciplines, always trying to perceive and analyze more and more of that whole of reality, bringing together the particular and the universal, the nitty-gritty of whichever particular discipline, with the broader philosophical and theological hinterland, the practical and the theoretical. And so we hope that we are a place of constructive critique in the best sense, a sort of trialogue, if you like, between the Church, the Academy, and the world, aimed at our common good. We're named after Anatole von Hügel, the intrepid anthropologist, explorer of Fiji, who combined his scholarly attention to anthropological particularities with the founding of both St. Edmund's College and Fisher House, the Catholic chaplaincy in this university, as places to foster that holistic or Catholic with a small c spirit within Cambridge. And I know that we'll see plenty of that spirit of Catholicity in our lecture this evening. Our lecturer this year is Cardinal Blase Cupich, Archbishop of Chicago. I'm sure all of you have come across that irritating feature, corrective or predictive text on your computers or phones. In the preparations for this lecture, every time I typed the Cardinal's Christian name, the computer insisted on Blase. But I can assure you there is nothing blasé or predictive about Cardinal Blase. He is Archbishop of the third largest diocese in America and has quickly become a local and national leader in the United States in the defense of migrants and refugees, advocacy against gun violence, and the promotion of the pastoral goals of Pope Francis, about which we will hear more. Indeed, I believe he was the personal choice of Pope Francis to head that diocese. So perhaps, cheekily, we could think of him as Francis's man in America. So who better to unfold for us the implications for a renewed sense of Catholicity to be found in Pope Francis's exhortation, Amoris Laetitia. So thank you very much, Your Eminence, for making time out between Mexico, Rome, and Chicago this week to visit us in the Fens. It's a huge honor to the Institute and to the College. Practicalities. The Cardinal will speak to us for about 45 minutes, after which we'll have time for questions from the floor, and then move over there for a drink. You're all most welcome to a service in the chapel at 6:15, our commemoration of benefactors, at which the Cardinal will also preach. If you're technological, and I'm not, you may tweet about this event using the hashtag #CupichCam, C-A-M. So, without further ado, please welcome Cardinal Blase Cupich to address us under the title Pope Francis's Revolution of Mercy, Amoris Laetitia as a New Paradigm for Catholicity.
Thank you. Thank you, Philip. It's good to be with you. And if you would want to reverse the order and have the drinks first, that's fine too. That might make things more palatable. It's really great to be with you, and I want to say thanks to Philip and the Institute for the invitation to be with you this afternoon. I really welcome this opportunity, this chance to contribute in some small way to the important work that you do here at the Institute. Curiosity about Catholicism is at an all-time high in Pope Francis' pontificate. I did not write those words. They appear on the webpage introducing the goals of the von Hügel Institute. That growing curiosity in Catholicism, the site explains, is spawned by a recognition that Pope Francis is tapping into a yearning the Institute is attempting to address, namely the need for a world view of reality, a Catholic with small c view. that connects all aspects of knowledge and practice in a differentiated unity, offering a needed corrective in an era when pressures of specialization and commodification have left work and knowledge so very fragmented. I was intrigued by how the aims of the von Hügel Institute are so easily associated with those of Pope Francis. At the least, it should signal to a wider audience beyond the Catholic Church that he just may have something to say to them. Sorry, I lost my place here. Especially if they are seeking a more holistic view of the world. But this appreciation of Francis also serves as an invitation to Catholics to take a fresh look at his agenda and come to see that he is introducing a more holistic approach to being church, one that more fully unites what we know and practice in our tradition in order to better respond to the realities that people face in their daily lives. In a recent interview with Cardinal Parolin, the Holy See Secretary of State, he was asked about the difficulties some seem to have in understanding the post-synodal apostolic exhortation, Amoris Laetitia. He responded that the Holy Father is offering a new paradigm in this document, one that calls us to embrace a new spirit, a change of direction in the way the Church carries out its ministry, especially ministry to families. At the heart of this shift is a fully incarnational approach, which the Cardinal explains is a two-way street. On the one hand, the Church embraces the family with the gospel. Yet since the family is already itself a gospel, the gospel of the family, there is a reciprocity to this incarnational approach that recognizes the contributions that families make to the Church's understanding and proclamation of the gospel. In other words, there has to be a holistic connection between our knowledge and our practice. Our ideas and our experience have to inform each other. With all of that in mind, I'm going to address two topics this afternoon. First, it is important to understand that Pope Francis is not offering this new approach, this new paradigm for family ministry in a vacuum. In chapter 2 of Amoris, he makes the case that the complex realities that couples and families face today are singularly different from those of the past. And if that is true, then a church that claims in the opening lines of Gaudium et Spes to be truly linked with humanity and its history by the deepest of bonds, that church cannot ignore this contemporary situation. A fresh approach is needed, one that is holistic and Catholic. In fact, as I will note in my conclusion, I'm convinced that some people misinterpret and misunderstand Amoris simply because they fail or refuse to take into consideration the present reality in all of its complexity. And in the second half of my presentation, I will build off of Cardinal Parolin's observation by pointing out where I believe a paradigm shift takes place in Amoris. The Pope does this, I will argue, on a number of levels through a set of interrelated interpretive principles. This allows him to offer a new and holistic response for family ministry. Following up on his appeal for a revolution of mercy launched with the Jubilee year, Pope Francis is both inviting and equipping the Church through this new hermeneutic to take up this mission in a new, imaginative, and yes, holistic way, especially as it relates to her ministry to couples and families. So let's take a look at the present reality. Pope Francis is convinced of the need for a new ministerial approach to families as he looks at the challenges facing families in today's world. His description of the present reality in chapter 2 of Amoris relies heavily on the worldwide consultation of the faithful and the deliberations of the bishops at the 2014 and 2015 synods on marriage and family. He masterfully puts on full display the complex web of still developing social, cultural, and economic realities in which families live. This situation, so different from the past, has created uncertainty as people take up the challenges of marriage and raising a family. The fact that family life has changed so significantly, he notes, cannot be ignored by the Church. While Pope Francis amply covers the many factors that have created this new reality for family life, it is sufficient to highlight here just one example. For instance, consider how many of the former social support systems families have relied on for transmitting values and traditions have all but evaporated. Robert Putnam writes about the impoverishment of social capital in his groundbreaking work, Bowling Alone. His research shows that there are many factors that have led to this impoverishment of social capital, leaving people increasingly disconnected from family, friends, and neighbors. One of the factors is increased mobility, which Pope Francis emphasizes. Globally, people today are on the move, many forced to flee for their lives in the midst of violence and famine. Others relocate to find meaningful work that pays a living wage. Being detached from the support system that earlier sustained and nourished people personally, economically, and socially puts significant stresses on all families, no matter their educational or income level. Both parents often feel forced to work to provide adequate and affordable child care while also meeting basic family needs. Less time is available for family life, let alone community life. Wives and mothers are particularly impacted in this situation. In addition to the fact that they traditionally have lacked equal access to employment and are paid less than men for comparable work, the burden of domestic chores often falls to women, so they are doubly stressed and impacted. The lack of a family support system particularly impacts young people, who for a variety of reasons often feel pressured to delay marriage and yet are deprived of a value system their family life provided. As a result, delaying marriage leads young persons to cohabit, sometimes without a firm commitment to marriage. This brings its own set of issues, particularly related to commitment and healthy interpersonal growth. Similarly, there is a breakdown of other community-based support systems. For instance, adult children are left to fend for themselves as they struggle to care for elderly family members or those with special needs. Moreover, deprived of these social resources, families are unable to access cultural activities and participate in the life of the broader community, both of which are important to living a full and rich life. Of course, none of this even begins to take into consideration the harm brought about by alienation and isolation created from this impoverishment of social capital, such as drug abuse and violence, nor have we touched on the seismic shifts in society, whether that be secularism or technology, globalization or terrorism, which affect marriages and families today. But this one example gives us a glimpse of how family life today is so dramatically different from the past, leaving many people disoriented and uncertain about their lives to the point that the Church must find a new way to minister to them. We also have to admit in all of this, with some admiration, that in spite of the loss of so much social capital, parents and married couples have developed new strategies to fill the gaps. They have assumed greater responsibility for their personal lives and the care and development of their families. With all of this in view, Pope Francis proposes a new response for the Church's approach to families. It begins with a healthy dose of self-criticism, readily admitting where the church has fallen short. But he also makes clear that in view of the new challenges families face today, there must be significant shifts in the way that we approach and think about our ministry to families. Amoris is nothing short of the Holy Father's call to action, in which he summons church leaders, both lay and clergy, to enter into a serious dialogue about how best to minister to couples and families in a way that is faithful, honest, and creative. All of this will involve thinking about marriage more holistically on a number of levels. The new hermeneutic. The new challenges of family life outlined above call for a new response from the church. The bishops gathered at the synods on the family were united in this regard, and in the end, voting for all of the proposals by over 2/3 vote, and in most cases, nearly unanimously. In response to the bishops, Pope Francis offers in Amoris Laetitia a new way of relating to the families, to the lives of families today, by introducing a new set of hermeneutical principles. These principles are deeply rooted in Scripture and tradition, and yet are profoundly attentive to the dynamics of marriage and family life in the contemporary world. These principles of interpretation, 6 in all, force a paradigm shift, allowing us to re-envision the church's engagement with couples and families, and opens a new pathway for doing so. As I discuss each one of them, I will also make some observations about their implications for the church's renewed ministry. The first principle: the family is a privileged site of God's self-revelation. The gospel of the family spans the history of the world. With these words, Pope Francis draws attention to a truth that courses through the Scriptures. God has chosen the family as a privileged place to reveal how God acts and relates to humanity in the world. This insight has enormous consequences. If we are serious about fully appreciating that the concrete lives of families and couples are part of salvation history in which God continues to engage and redeem humanity, then at the least it will mean moving away from presenting an abstract and idealized presentation of marriage. Instead, we should begin with a view that married life is a challenging mosaic made up of many different realities, with all their joys, hopes, and problems, as the Pope puts it in Amoris Laetitia number 38. Likewise, if we accept that families are a privileged place of God's self-revelation and activity, then no family should be considered deprived of God's grace. Our ministerial approach should begin with the understanding that families are not problems to solve. Rather, they are opportunities for the church to discern, with the aid of the Spirit, how God is active in our time and what God is calling us to do here and now. It is not solely in the glimpses of perfection that families may reveal the presence and action of Christ to the church. Perhaps even more often, they reveal Christ's action in their imperfect attempts at love and compassion, which permeate ordinary life. The Lord's presence dwells in real and concrete families with all their daily troubles, struggles, joys, and hopes, the Pope explains. In fact, Pope Francis, relying on observations of the Synod participants, affirms that the manifestation of God's self-revelation is not restricted to those who meet the Church's marital ideals. It can be found in true natural marriages and in the forms of marriage found in other religious traditions, even if at times obscurely. He also admits a possibility of God's grace working in those involved in second marriages. It can no longer simply be said, he notes, that all those in any quote-unquote irregular situation are living in a state of mortal sin and are deprived of sanctifying grace. In all these ways, Pope Francis reminds us that the family is such a privileged place of God's self-revelation that nothing can stand in the way of God's grace. The presupposition must always be that whenever there is a family striving to live together and love one another, the Spirit is already present. The task of those who minister to families then is to open their eyes to see and to help families discern where God is calling them. All of this represents an enormous change of approach, a paradigm shift, holistically rooted in Scripture, tradition, and in human experience. The second principle. The Synodal Church accompanies families by balancing teaching and learning. The first interpretive principle leads directly to this second one. Because families are a privileged place of God's self-revelation and action in the world, there needs to be a shift in the way the Church's ministers interact with families and married couples. It should be marked by mutual respect for the movement of the Spirit. Ministers must accompany families in a process of discernment. They must always do so by maintaining a balance between teaching and listening, so that all remain open to the possibility of learning from one another and seeking to understand the mystery of God together. Thus, in a genuinely synodal church, there is no hierarchical distinction between those with knowledge and those without. As such, the most important consequences of this call to accompaniment ought to be greater attention to the voices of the laity, especially on matters of marriage and family life, for they live this reality day to day. This is the way a synodal church acts. It goes without saying that this will also mean rejecting an authoritarian or paternalistic way of dealing with people that lays down the law, that pretends to have all the answers or easy answers to complex problems, that suggests that general rules will seamlessly bring immediate clarity, or that the teachings of our tradition can preemptively be applied to the particular challenges confronting couples and families. In its place, a new direction will be required, one that envisions ministry as accompaniment, an accompaniment which we will see is marked by a deep respect for the conscience of the faithful. Now, certainly the Church, ever faithful to the Great Commission of Matthew 28, will always need those who teach. That is why Pope Francis maintains, in no way must the Church desist from proposing the full ideal of marriage, God's plan in all of its grandeur. After all, the great values of marriage and the Christian family correspond to the yearning that is part and parcel of human existence. The Church can and indeed must be true to the teachings that we have received, and so bishops and ministers, theologians, should be ready to instruct as those who accompany married couples and families. But it is always an accompaniment that involves a process of listening and learning that guides the faithful to an awareness of their situation before God. Accompaniment requires the sensitivity of a spiritual director or a close friend who can listen to the experiences of another humbly, not pretending to have all the answers, and always ready to help discern the movements of the Spirit in that particular moment. But the accompaniment also is an act of forming church teaching. There is a continuum of accompaniment which undergirds this entire range of actions by the Church, and thus, as we will discuss below more fully, the core goal of formal teaching on marriage is accompaniment, not the pursuit of an abstract, isolated set of truths. This represents a major shift in our ministerial approach that is nothing short of revolutionary. The third, the conscience of the faithful are essential in the task of discernment. The mutual respect in discerning the movement of the Spirit in the process of accompaniment opens up a third shift that provides a more complete understanding of the role of conscience. Rather than limiting the function of conscience to knowing moral truth about actions in the past and objective truth in the present, conscience also discerns the future, asking, what is God asking of me now? This is how Pope Francis puts it. Yet conscience can do more than recognize that a given situation does not correspond objectively to the overall demands of the gospel. It can also recognize, with sincerity and honesty, what for now is the most generous response which can be given to God, and come to see with a certain moral security that it is what God Himself is asking amid the concrete complexity of one's life, while yet not fully the objective ideal. In any event, let us recall that this discernment is dynamic. It must remain ever open to new stages of growth and to new decisions which can enable the ideal to be more fully realized. The starting point for the role of conscience in this new hermeneutic is Gaudium et Spes number 16, which identifies conscience as the most secret core and sanctuary of a man, where he is alone with God, whose voice echoes in his depths. When taken seriously, this definition demands a profound respect for the discernment of married couples and families. Their decisions of conscience represent God's personal guidance for the particularities of their lives. In other words, the voice of conscience, the voice of God, or if I may be permitted to quote an Oxford man here at Cambridge, what Newman called the aboriginal vicar of Christ, could very well affirm the necessity of living at some distance from the Church's understanding of the ideal, while nevertheless calling a person to new stages of growth and to new decisions which can enable the ideal to be more fully realized. In view of this, the Holy Father encourages pastors numerous times throughout the exhortation to exercise careful discernment. Pastors, properly trained and sufficiently familiar with the particular circumstances of those involved in this process of discernment, are to take into account the complexity of various situations. It is hard to overstate the significance of this hermeneutical shift. By fully embracing the understanding of conscience found in Gaudium et Spes, Pope Francis points not only to the possibility of accompaniment in the Church's ministry with families, but also its necessity. The fourth principle. The Church's understanding of God's plan for marriage must incorporate the insights of the faithful. A logical consequence of the first three paradigm shifts is a need for the Church to incorporate the insights of the faithful, not just generally, but specifically into teachings about marriage and family. If, as the Pope observes, the aim of Church teaching is to present marriage more as a dynamic path to personal development and fulfillment than as a lifelong burden, then there can be no better teacher for the Church than the faithful who actively walk this path of personal development. From their experience, we quickly learn that we have much work to do together. Many people, the Pope acknowledges, feel that the Church's message on marriage and family does not clearly reflect the preaching and attitudes of Jesus, who set forth the demanding ideal yet never failed to show compassion and closeness to the frailty of individuals. Pope Francis calls us to listen to these concerns with a welcoming heart and to take responsibility for the shortcomings that have led to these types of conclusions. As noted above, the Holy Father himself reminds us at times we have also proposed a far too abstract and almost artificial theological ideal of marriage, far removed from the concrete situations and practical possibilities of real families. The most appropriate remedy, of course, is to attend to the concrete situations of real families, inviting the lay faithful to help the whole church understand and promote marriage and family life as a source of true fulfillment. We can no longer treat the church's vision for marriage as, quote, dead stones to be hurled at others, as the Pope says in very colorful language, but must instead see it as a living tradition that comes to its full expression through a dynamic process of reflection and development over time, with the insight of those who constantly navigate the tensions between abstract ideal and its actual manifestation. We will have the resources necessary to articulate the divine plan for marriage and family in a way that inspires hope rather than despair at the awareness of what they currently are not. The fifth principle, accompaniment that attends to the pastoral and local while upholding doctrinal and universal concerns. As a consequence of creating space for the work of prudence in the Church's ministry of accompaniment, a fifth paradigm shift is required, and it happens on two levels. First, when dealing with particular cases, a pastoral and not merely doctrinal approach is needed. This approach must recognize that people can find themselves in a variety of situations which should not be pigeonholed or fit into overly rigid classifications. Acknowledging the immense variety of concrete situations, the Pope calls for a responsible, personal, and pastoral discernment of particular cases, one which would recognize that since the degree of responsibility is not equal in all cases, the consequences or effects of a rule need not necessarily always be the same. The result is not relativism or an arbitrary application of the doctrinal law, but an authentic receptivity of God's self-revelation in the concrete realities of family life and to the work of the Holy Spirit in the consciences of the faithful. A pastoral discernment attends to the reality of a situation. The conscience-based Christian moral life does not focus primarily on the automatic application of universal principles. Rather, it is continually immersed in the concrete situations which give vital context to our moral choice. Here, the Holy Father makes a unique contribution to the understanding of the role of conscience in the discernment process. In fact, the real shift towards a pastoral approach involves creating a culture of care, hospitality, and tenderness in the parish community on behalf of those who have been wounded. In the particular case of those in second marriages, pastors must allow them not only to realize that they belong to the church as the body of Christ, but also to know that they can have a joyful and fruitful experience of it. Such persons need to feel not as excommunicated members of the church, but instead as living members, able to live and grow in the church and experience her as a mother who welcomes them always, who takes care of them with affection and encourages them along the path of life and the gospel. Likewise, there has to be a balance between the universal and local concerns. The Pope stresses the importance of local variation in our global church. Not all discussions of doctrinal, moral, or pastoral issues need to be settled by the interventions of the magisterium, the Pope states. Instead, as pastors attend to the distinct needs of persons in front of them with all the complex matters of family life, different communities will have to devise more practical and effective initiatives that respect both the church's teaching and the local problems and needs. But while admitting that different cultural realities call for different pastoral conclusions, this is not to suggest that the existence of widely varying teachings among regions or dioceses is a positive element in the Church's life. This is still a dilemma that needs further attention and study, lest we end up with opposing magisterial directives even within regions that share a similar culture or realities in family life. In this regard, Pope Francis has now offered a pathway forward with the publication in Acta Apostolicae Sedis of his letter to the bishops of Buenos Aires and their Pastoral, which confirms that their interpretation of Amoris authentically reflects his mind as being official church teaching. It will now be up to all in the Church, particularly the hierarchy, to respond in a spirit of affective and effective collegiality with the successor of Peter, ever keeping in mind paragraph 25 of the dogmatic constitution on the Church, Lumen Gentium. And the final principle. The doctrinal can develop through the pastoral as a gospel of mercy informs the ministry of the Church. This final shift is a result of resituating mercy at the heart of the gospel to the point that we should always consider inadequate any theological conception which in the end puts in doubt the omnipotence of God and especially God's mercy. From the earliest days of the Church, there have been two approaches: casting off and reinstating. The Church's way, from the time of the Council of Jerusalem, the Holy Father insists, has always been the way of Jesus, the way of mercy, reinstatement. In fact, the Church's pastoral practice of accompanying others in mercy should inform and shape doctrinal development. The teaching of moral theology should not fail to incorporate these considerations, he says and urges in Amoris Laetitia 3:11, because they emphasize and encourage the highest and most central values of the gospel. In other words, doctrinal development is about remaining open to the invitation to see our moral teachings on marriage and family life through the lens of God's omnipotent mercy. This proper relationship between the Church's experiences of pastoral accompaniment and doctrinal development is the linchpin that holds together the other hermeneutical principles. Doctrine can develop as a result of the Church's merciful accompaniment of families, because God has chosen the family as a privileged place to reveal all that the God of mercy is doing in our time. To deny this, the Holy Father warns, would make us guilty of the worst way of watering down the gospel. As I said at the outset, the project of the von Hügel Institute has given me a chance to take a second look at what Pope Francis is offering in Amoris, for which I thank you. Without a holistic approach to examining the questions of the day, one that connects knowing and practice, we end up with a fragmented and partial way of understanding and knowledge, which limits then our practice. What emerges from this rereading of Amoris is that the Holy Father is offering a revivified hermeneutic that involves a paradigm shift on a number of levels. He does this by connecting tradition and experience, teaching and practice, in a way that better responds to the realities people face in their daily lives. And now I use the word revivified intentionally, since the word new is not quite accurate. In reality, Pope Francis is retrieving a way of thinking about church teaching and practice that has deep roots in our tradition. This study also convinces me that the failure to take a holistic approach in the examination of questions related to marriage and family life has led some critics to misinterpret and misunderstand Amoris. Instead of actually attending to the present reality of people's lives today in all of its complexity, they limit their scope to an idealistic understanding of marriage and family. They also fail to see how the various issues related to marriage and family life are connected to each other, treating them instead as discrete questions. As a result, they narrow their options when it comes to responding to the lived realities of people's lives, since their knowledge is fragmented and incomplete. Pope Francis presents these interpretive principles specifically as a means to enable ministers in the Church to decipher more reliably and realistically the experiences of people in modern family life. Yet I believe they give further evidence of the importance of thinking in the round, seeing all of reality through an underlying unity in the etymological sense of Catholic that enables fresh conversations and new directions, all geared towards the common good. Again, not my words, but those of your institute. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Your Eminence. I think your talk illustrates very well, by unpacking those 6 principles, how, well, radical, revolutionary, and important the pastoral goals of Pope Francis are, and I hope that our institute can unpack those further and develop them. There's so much packed into that I think there's going to be lots of questions. So, Michael, would you like to start? Please speak clearly into the microphone and keep your questions relatively brief to enable as many as people as possible to speak.
And could you tell me who you are and where you're from and that type of thing?
Thank you very much, Your Eminence. I'm Michael Miller. I'm MPhil in theology here. I'm a convert. My father's an Anglican priest, minister. And like most converts, Pope Francis presents certain difficulties, which is ironic. Particularly, my question is about our experience of becoming Catholics really for the sake of conscience, for the sake of inhabiting a community where, precisely because there are absolutely objective standards, conscience has a place and means something. And coming into that community from a society where conscience has evaporated because there are no standards. And my question then is there a place in Pope Francis' church for people whose experience of conscience is that actually it depends on those absolutely immovable standards, rather than being the get-out clause that allows us to circumvent them? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. I would say this. I think that there is a role of conscience that you allude to in terms of being able to decipher what is the objective moral standard, and that's a very important part of the role of conscience. But conscience also means, in the Catholic tradition, has always meant something the Pope is emphasizing even more so, that not only do you look at reality in terms of past acts or present, but you also have to have the sense of conscience developed by asking the question, where's God calling me now to next? And that's so very important in a church today where it's very easy to kind of just settle in and saying, I have the whole package here and I've kind of arrived with the truth and I can kind of coast and don't have to ask the more demanding, summoning question, where God is calling me to now next. Because we can very easily limit ourselves to what objective truths we want to identify, whether they have to do with the human sexual issues or the ones of social justice in the world, to the questions of the environment that the Pope talks about in Laudato Si. So there has to be a dynamic sense of that conscience. So it's not an either or, it's a both and. And I think that that's the real Catholic view that has always been part of our tradition that the Pope speaks of. Yes, I'll let the microphone people identify people. Yes.
Could I ask you what...
Can you tell me who you are? Yeah, use a microphone.
I'm Teresa Brett.
Could you use that microphone?
Yes, I don't work. I'm not able to work.
Yeah.
I've got all kinds of brain diseases.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
But I wanted to ask you about the family point.
Yeah.
Because I've forgotten which gospel it is, but one of them, where the disciples, the apostles, are saying to him, just let us go home to our families, to those to whom we promised ourselves. We promised to look after them forever, be with them forever. And then Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Follow me. Mm-hmm. And they have to leave their families. Does that mean we conclude that the Holy Spirit showed the families somehow?
Well, of course, I'd have to look at that text more clearly, and it's always difficult for me to make an immediate application of a scriptural text to a particular question. But I know that time and again Jesus has shown the importance of family life by visiting homes, by caring in families, by bringing people, that wonderful scene in which he stops the woman whose son is dead, and the gospel writer says very clearly, not only did he bring him back from the dead, but he gave him back to his mother. That there is a sensitivity on the part of Christ for the family. So there may be one of the other instances in terms of one's call to discipleship of not looking back to one's past in one's family that might make a demand. But for the most part, I think the overwhelming evidence in the scripture is that Jesus is very pro-family.
My name is John Rist. I'm a retired professor of philosophy. Your Eminence, in view of your account of the holistic features and the sunny features of Pope Francis' Revolution of Mercy, which is described in the leaflet here as a paradigm shift, a phrase that you've used several times, and also the Pope's call for free and frank discussion of his challenging proposals and policies, I'd like to ask why Pope Francis acts so mercilessly in insulting and eliminating doctrinal opponents. Cardinal Burke removed from the rota, 3 priests from the CDF dismissed without explanation, followed by the abrupt termination of Cardinal Müller. The denial of a cardinal's hat to the much-loved champion of the unborn, Archbishop Chaput. The removal of most of the original members of the Academy for Life. The apparent selling down the river of Cardinal Pell, who may have been framed. And most recently, the banishment from Rome of the professor and editor of the challenging book, Remaining in the Truth of Christ. The list goes on, but I stop there to ask whether harsh actions of this sort, combined with the well-documented rigging of the Synod on the Family, indicate that the Pope's paradigm shift should be recognized as an attempt, under cover of offering solutions to genuine social problems in Western society, to impose on the Church radical changes of doctrine, developed not by the laity, but largely in Germany by a group of relativists and Hegelian theologians. Thank you.
Well, I think that first of all, there really are a lot of assumptions there about the motivations of the Pope in terms of the way things worked out. I could look at any papacy in terms of decisions or things that happened and attribute motives to those popes about what happened. So I think that we need to step back and say, do we really have all the story, or are we listening to sources that pretend to have the story? I think we have to be very suspicious of that. Let me make a comment too about the fact that the synod was rigged. I was at the synod in 2015. There was open discussion. I was in the main aula. I was in the small groups. I can tell you, in the small groups, people came in with ideas about what was important and what they needed to talk about. There was, you could see, a shift taking place in their appreciation of the demands that families endure today that needed to be addressed. And there was an honest effort to try to grapple with those. There was no preconceived dumping in of what had to be said. And if there were, then the way that that could have been cured is all the votes, when it came to the principles, to the proposals in the final document that led to Amoris Laetitia, all of those votes were done secretively. So if people really felt in some way that something was being foisted on them, they could have taken action, but the documents all passed by over 2/3. So I would be very suspicious of these narratives out there that are impugning the reputation of the Pope, or in some way putting motives in him that are, from my point, unfounded. I think the other question, though, has to be to people who make those statements or who create that narrative, is, do you really believe that the Holy Spirit was not present at the synods? That the Holy Father is not inspired by the Holy Spirit in writing this document? Do we really believe that the Spirit is no longer guiding the Church? Because that's why I pointed out Lumen Gentium 25. Because the Pope has now said this is official Church teaching as crafted by the bishops of Buenos Aires, there is a demand for all of us to embrace with mind and will, as Lumen Gentium says, what that official Church teaching is. So I would turn it back on those who have difficulties, and even those, I think, who are creating these narratives that are unfortunate, to ask themselves in conscience how they answer that question.
Hi, I'm Yaz. I'm a theoretical physicist. I'll try and keep this short. I know that Mystery of Talk was about family and marriage, but I want to go back a little bit and ask about another thing that maybe has changed in the contemporary world to individual Catholics, that maybe hasn't been seen in the last 1,000 years, and that's kind of the source of Catholic identity. And I like a lot of what you said about the Pope, and a lot of what Pope Francis has tried to do with marriage and family. I only ask about sort of the extent at which the Catholic Church has almost control to change the story on how to practice the Catholic faith. And I just want to point to maybe one example of something. I think there are more examples, but this is hopefully illustrative. Let's say Fox News in the US. I know that you're in the US as well. Many individuals, they go to church once a week. They get their idea of how they're supposed to practice their own personal faith from their minister. They go home, and that's what's been happening for the last 1,000 years. In the last 10 years, you know, you go to your church once a week, but maybe every day you're watching a few hours of Fox News. There are some things to talk about, like, have you heard of War on Christmas? There's lots of different, Christianity is almost imbued in a lot of what panelists say on that channel. I think a lot of people feel that their own personal beliefs are motivated by what they see in the media. So I'm wondering your thoughts on that, whether you've encountered them.
Well, yeah, I think you're accurate in saying that there are people's worldviews are being shaped by their sources of information that they rely on, and that becomes even more problematic when our politics have become so tribal. And that's what's happening, at least I can speak of our country. But I think your question also highlights the point that I was trying to make about the importance of the kind of exercise of conscience that's needed in the responsible disciple, the person who's taking responsibility for their lives. That they really have to say to themselves, am I going to rely on those sources of information that are just going to in some way reinforce my comfortable look at the world? Or am I really going to tend to the gospel demands as a disciple and ask the question, where is God calling me now? That's the true exercise of conscience, huh? And that's why the church needs to help people live their discipleship out in that more dynamic way, rather than just saying, okay, I got the principles down, I got the doctrine down, I got it, and I can kind of coast. Or I can do that, and then I can also be very racist and xenophobic in my attitude about immigrants. You know, I don't have to worry about that. I don't have to allow the Word of God to make me disturbed. And that's what we're trying. That's what the Pope is trying to get at.
Thank you very much. Your Eminence, James Allison, priest and theologian from from Madrid in Spain. Well, that's where I live anyhow. One of the fascinating things which you brought out in that talk, and which I hadn't noticed before when I read Amoris Laetitia, is how much the paradigm shift is a paradigm shift concerning what is meant by a teacher. And it brought out to mind one of the difficulties with the reception of it and with taking it forward is precisely that Pope Francis seems to be nudging us beyond the traditional, let's say, icon of God as a lawgiver, and bringing out that when God came among us as a teacher, it wasn't as a lawgiver, but a rather more subtle form of teacher. Francis himself enacts that very frequently among us, and it's rather beautiful. The difficulty is that the legal paradigm, in fact, makes it much easier to teach, whereas the personal teacher who is nudging people into new positions, whose word is calling people out, disturbing, as you were saying, is very much more difficult to reproduce. How are we going to keep that new vision of what the teacher, the real teacher, the magister, the one magister who's behind the magisterium, how are we going to keep that vision alive for longer than the many years which I hope our Lord gives Pope Francis?
Well, I think that every age, every papacy brings their own contribution, and there are ebbs and flows to that contribution. We saw that with John the 23rd, with the Second Vatican Council. There was this real burst of energy and renewal in the Catholic Church, and then people felt it kind of waned, and now it's on the rise. I don't worry about any of that, because I believe the Holy Spirit is alive in the Church. I was having dinner one night with a Hollywood producer who wasn't Catholic, wasn't Christian, and he said, "I really like this Pope." I said, "Why?" He says, I don't, he speaks to me. What makes him tick, he said. What makes him get up in the morning and do what he's doing? What do I need to know about this, to know what this man's about? And I said, well, first of all, he really believes that Jesus rose from the dead. And not only in the past, but is alive and leading the church now. And he's just trying to look at where he's taking us. He really believes that at the heart of his ministry. And I think that comes out. Now, this man looked at me like I just came in from Mars. I mean, it never occurred to him that was at issue. But I think that is central to what the Pope is. Let me just say this, that the model of magister, of teacher that the Pope is offering, is the one that Jesus gave. What did he say? I came not to teach you things, I came to give you life. Any good teacher in the classroom, and I've taught in the classroom many years, has to realize that it's not just a communication of information that's the goal of that educational enterprise, but it's to enhance the life of the people that you teach. And in doing that, you learn something. So that's the dynamic. People do that every day in the teaching world. So I'm not afraid that that's going to go away. That happens every day in a classroom. Teachers give life. And that's the kind of teacher the church has to be.
Dan Hitchens from Catholic Herald. Thanks for your talk, Your Eminence. Something you mentioned a couple of times was the Buenos Aires guidelines on Amoris Laetitia, which the Pope has approved, and which I've found in reporting on, a bit like the joke about economists. If you ask 3 theologians, you get 4 opinions. One thing that some people have suggested as a sort of an interpretive key to Amoris Laetitia and the subsequent documents is the resolution of the act of contrition and the resolution not to sin again. That if I've carried out an abortion, if I've thrown racist abuse at someone, if I've committed a sin against the 6th commandment, that I have to in the confessional say, I resolve not to sin again, and renounce that sin in order to receive absolution and open the way to communion. So I wonder if you think that's a helpful principle to bring this together, to say that the the resolution of amendment is key in how the Church does discern how to respond to people in difficult situations.
Mm-hmm. Yes, part of the rite of reconciliation, the confession of sins, sacrament of penance, is have a firm commitment to not sin again. And yet, the popes throughout the ages, and Benedict XVI has written about this as well. It doesn't mean that there's a condition that the priest is going to impose on the person that they can't sin again, or that it's not possible that they will, and then deny them confession, deny them absolution. So it is, you have to have, but what the Pope is saying too is that you also have to have a firm amendment that you're going to get closer to the ideal. And that's what I put in the paper, and the Argentinian bishops say that as well, that it's just the next best step that I can take here and now in the present moment that God is calling me to. And that's the firm purpose of amendment, it seems to me, that has to be made.
I am a mother, also a grandmother. I have been a teacher both in university and in school, and I'm currently a writer. Your Eminence made allusion to Cardinal Newman, a great Englishman and a great theologian. In his famous book on the development of Christian doctrine, he taught that Catholic, I should add that he was recently beatified by the predecessor of Pope Francis, Pope Benedict. He taught that Catholic doctrine develops, as it were, organically over the centuries. Or, as your countryman George Weigel recently expressed it, the Church does not, quote, do paradigm shifts, to which you've alluded several times. How then would your Eminence seek to reconcile these contrasting positions, or would you simply discard that of Newman?
Well, first of all, I reject the idea that a paradigm shift is a rupture and is not part of organic development. I think that, for instance, a paradigm shift occurred in the life and history of the Church often, and we call them councils. There is not a council that you can look at where there was not the kind of shift in the way that we do things. The Council of Jerusalem, of course, being the first one. A major shift in the way the Church exercised its approach to the world and questions of the day. So, but it did it in a way with the guidance of the Holy Spirit, looking at tradition, but also the needs of the people at that time. All those elements are there, which Cardinal Newman says in his document on his writings on doctrinal development should be a part of what the doctrinal development is about. So I think that the premise that paradigm shift means a break from the past is unfounded. Now, it's true that the originator of the term paradigm shift meant it in that way, but it is commonly used today in writings and in scholarship as saying that you move to a new level of understanding that builds on what you already know. So I think there's a presupposition there that paradigm shift means a break. And so I disagree that the Church doesn't do paradigm shift. We call them councils.
Your Eminence, I'm an engineering undergraduate here at Cambridge from Portugal. And so my question is a little bit about the practicality of Chapter 8 of Amoris Laetitia. So how in practice can a remarried person whose marriage was not nulled by the Church and does marriage twice in conscience and who does not abstain from a sexual relationship be not chargeable or not completely chargeable of his or her objective situation of sin?
Mm-hmm.
And if he, she are in grave sin, how can their access to the Holy Communion be allowed in such a circumstance?
Thank you. That's a very helpful question. So the question is, how can someone, in fact, who does something that is understood as objectively wrong, sexual relationships outside of a committed, recognized marriage of the Church, then go to have the possibility in some circumstances of receiving the sacrament? It's because the Church has always made the distinction between an act that is objectively wrong and the actor of that. so that the culpability is mitigated by circumstances that the individual either doesn't have the freedom or full knowledge to do that. If you would look at, for instance, the document of the commission from the Congregation of the Theological Commission of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Church, CDF, which was, by the way, authored during the time when Pope Benedict was the prefect, the document on natural law, there that commission outlines what are the mitigating circumstances in which culpability is limited. And so we know that all the time, that a person's actions, even though the actions involved something that's objectively an evil, they are not always culpable for it. And that's what the Holy Father outlines in the document. That's standard moral teaching of the Church. It's always been that way. He also quotes St. Thomas Aquinas, who said that the more that you move from the general principle to a particular case, the less the general principle applies. That goes back to St. Thomas Aquinas. So the Church has always felt that way, that there's a difference between those two. Distinctions are important to make.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Song Mi, and I don't really know about Amoris Laetitia or anything. I live in here.
Thank you.
And I live in here and I study international politics. Actually, but I just hear your excellent lecture, and then I thought, like, when you emphasize the role of conscience for a person, and certainly when I look at myself and I look at my past, there are so many decisions that I really regret now, but I believe that I was in full conscience of myself. I was feeling relatively comfortable when I made certain decisions, but I really regret now. And I don't know about other people's conscience, but I know certainly I cannot really fully trust my conscience. So how do you resolve that issue?
Yeah. Well, I think there's not a person in this room who doesn't feel the same way you do. That we did things in the past, maybe we didn't exercise our conscience, we didn't employ our conscience, but we did anyway, and we regret doing. That insight that you have, even on that, is an act of conscience that in fact makes you suspicious that there have to be other aspects in your consideration of making conscience a decision of conscience that were not there in the past. So you've learned through that. So the very fact that you are identifying that is a healthy development of your own conscience, and that's part of life, though, for all of us as we get older. We look at the decision we made and said, that was pretty stupid. But the other part of it is this, and there's a wonderful text, by the way, in the 6th Sunday of Ordinary Time in the opening oration, in which it talks about how we have been snatched back from the edge. Eripuisti, you have snatched us back, is the Latin. Unfortunately, we didn't use that English word snatched. I think we used the more Latin word delivered, which is too bad, because that word snatched has a sense. How many of us, as we look at our lives, where God has just snatched us back from the jaws of our own self-destruction because of our foolishness, and we've experienced the mercy of God, that reflection also has to be a part of our self-understanding of who we are. In real humility, I feel that time and again in my life, that God has been so merciful to me and snatched me back. I wish the translation would have been better. That's another topic. But take a look at that. It's the 6th Sunday of Ordinary Time. I think it's the opening prayer.
Your Eminence, I'm Eamon Duffy. I'm a church historian. We've had quotations from Newman, and while I've been listening, a quotation from Newman occurred to me. Newman was an Oratorian, and he wrote a series of texts about the ministry of Philip Neri in Rome, one of which seems to me very pertinent to what you've been saying. It's the 3rd or 4th verse of a poem he wrote, and it goes, "Love is his bond, he knows no other fetter, asks not our all, but takes whate'er we spare him, willing to lead us on from good to better, as we can bear him. And that seems to me to sum up Pope Francis's strategy.
Beautiful. Thank you very much. Where is that found?
It's a poem called St. Philip in His School.
Okay, I'm going to look at that. Thank you. That's a great quote. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Eminence. I'm Garrod. I'm a student of mathematics here at Cambridge. You described the ideal of the family that the Church holds as being maybe abstract, not entirely maybe realistic, kind of in a vacuum. But the ideal, that, in my understanding, is that the Church holds the Holy Family to be our ideal of the family. And there are examples of those through history who've emulated it. Saint Therese of Lisieux, she was a saint. Her parents were both saints. So are we to take the Holy Family as abstract?
No, in fact, I think that I'm glad you brought up the Holy Family, because look at the complexity of that situation. An unwed mother, where everybody thinks that, you know, people don't think that Joseph is a husband, that they're refugees that have to flee. They're very poor, that their firstborn son is in a manger, that they have to scrape out a living, that the mother and the brothers we hear in the Gospels come and think Jesus is crazy and they want to take him away. Yeah, it is the ideal family. I mean, it's. I mean, this is the way families are. Behind every family is a mess. Let's be honest, huh? But that's where God's grace is. God has chosen to be in the mess, to be in every family, huh? The Scripture, and this is a beautiful insight that the Pope says from the very beginning of Amoris, that we have always overlooked, and I've always overlooked. God has chosen family as a, if not the, privileged place to redeem himself. And those are families like David, huh? Abraham. You go through whole Scriptures, where does God reveal himself most? In families that are broken. And he's there with them. That can't be ignored. If that's the case, then we as ministers have to look at families with their struggles not as problems to solve, but as moments of grace for us, in which we understand God more fully, because that's where God's working. It's in the limited circumstances and the frailty of human life that God graces us. That's what the Pope is saying. I find that to be very hopeful.
Janet Lash, I'm a retired teacher. Your Eminence, thank you. I want to go race home and reread Amoris Laetitia, so good. That's a good thing.
That's the goal of my talk.
But my question, we've been talking about conscience. Given that most people have very little contact actually with the church,
yeah.
You know, they go to Mass on Sunday, let's hope, and they listen to a 15-minute homily. How
the Pope said yesterday that to keep it to 10.
Okay. Okay. But how practically do we develop conscience?
Yeah, and that's why I put at the end too that it's not just up to the pastoral minister or the priest to be the one who accompanies people in the development of conscience. I think, and this is where I'm trying to do this as the Archbishop of Chicago, we have 350 parishes, over 200 schools, the biggest Catholic school system in the United States. It's all privately funded. We don't get any government money from that. But I'm trying to get our parishes to in fact be those communities that accompany people who are the field hospital, as the Pope calls it, huh? So that church isn't just coming and getting your Catholic ticket punched by going to Mass on Sunday because it's the law of the church, or donating, or occasionally maybe helping out the soup kitchen or at a funeral, but that you're really, as a parish, going to be intentional as disciples to be that center of care and concern that accompanies people who are broken and who are having to. I think the more the church does that, the more attractive it's going to be for people to come, rather than just be a club or a social enclave of folks who are the same economic or educational background, which sometimes happens. So how do you make the church that caring, tender mother that in fact people feel as though there's a space where they can be accompanied? That's the renewal that has to take place.
Bertolt Kress, I'm an art historian. You spoke a lot about a holistic approach. I felt that one part of the holistic approach was missing. The thing we are destined for and what will happen to us, the last things, judgment, purgatory, heaven and hell. And I would regard the church's primary job not to accompany people nice on earth, but to equip them and help them to go to heaven. How does this help? Which guidelines do you give? The Psalms is very easy. If you want to go a good life and be with God, avoid evil, do good. And now I hear all these things about dialogue and accompaniment. Will the church in this model you've presented be a tool to help the people to reach God? Or will it be just a social club to clap on everyone's shoulders, like I would say some of the more liberal Anglicans do? Everything you do is wonderful, you're a good work, don't bother about anything else. Does this prepare you when you meet God's judgment?
Yes, but I think that is true. But what the Lord is going to ask us is, how did we treat those who were lost? What efforts did we make to help those who could not find the way, who were caught up in addiction of sin, who felt as though they were alienated and could not in some way come back to the church? We use an expression in the United States: just because you were born on third base doesn't mean you hit a home run. There are a lot of us who were born on third base. We had good families. We had good schooling, good opportunities. But there are a lot of people who didn't. There are a lot of people who are lost in the cracks. And I see them every day in Chicago, who belong to gangs, who are having struggles in raising their families because of joblessness or racism. And those people feel as though the church is not reaching out to them to help them get to heaven, that we don't care, that we're just going to be a self-referential church and take care of ourselves and forget about the rest of the people and not listen to where people's lives are. And plus the fact we're going to miss out on where God's grace is active. And we're going to be impoverished as a result. That's the question I think I'm going to be asked about at the end. Not whether or not I just kept all the 10 Commandments. Look at that last judgment scene where Jesus had the sheep and the goats. I think that, did you feed the hungry? Did you? That Jesus has told us what the last judgment scene is going to look like. And that's the fear of the Lord that I have, of how I'm going to ask that question. And I feel that very strongly as a bishop, as a pastor of people, that I'm responsible for.
We should draw the formal proceedings to a close now and carry on with informal conversation.
You're all dying for a drink.
Exactly. To the drink.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.